Welcome. Today we're shifting focus a little bit and moving from the individual to the huge and horrible historical reality of the Holocaust and of the mass killings and extermination of the Jews. We're talking today, too briefly, about genocide and mass murder in the 20th century. And we're also talking about how history can and should and has sometimes failed to understand and come to grips with the realities which are encompassed in those handful of words. We have been considering the question of history by considering Mark Bloch and his writings about history and the philosophy of history. We've considered what history means to us and how we should understand it. Throughout the course, we are also reading about the lives and works of individual people, Mark Bloch, Hannah Arendt, eventually Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi administrator, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German, brave, heroic theologian. And today we're considering the recurring theme of Holocaust, genocide, and horrific crimes against human beings in the millions. And we're considering how historians and the discipline of history should confront this evil. So there is the interesting question of what is involved in knowing something about history. And so I pose the question, what do most Americans know about the Holocaust? It was a horrible crime. It was a deliberate program of extermination. Over 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. Other groups were also targeted, including Roma people, homosexuals, and communists. It was the result of racist Nazi ideology. There were particular agents of this evil: Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Hess, Eichmann. There were countless ordinary people across the face of Europe, in Germany, and many other countries who facilitated this evil, the banality of evil. There were some heroes who fought against the killing: Wallenberg, Schindler, Bonhoeffer, Mark Bloch, the villagers of Le Chambron. There are noted tragic victims: Anne Frank, Maximilian Kolbe. And the Allies could have done much more to disrupt the killing and to facilitate escape for some of the Jews of Europe. These are common beliefs and forms of knowledge that many, probably most Americans have about the Holocaust. But I would ask you to notice how thin this body of beliefs is, how undetailed. It is barely thick enough to constitute knowledge of the Holocaust. It is encapsulated in just a few sentences. If it has emotional content, it is a hazy version of the emotions of pity and sorrow. Is this really knowledge? And is it adequate to the realities that it represents? When we repeat the words "never again," do we know what we're saying? And how can a more full and satisfactory level of knowledge of this horrifying and defining event of the 20th century be achieved? This is the central problem of historical understanding of the Holocaust and of genocide. The photograph here is from the museum and death camp of Auschwitz, and it is an attempt to personalize the murder which occurred there. There is a practical consequence of having a more personal experience and understanding and emotional engagement with this historical horror. This experience strongly pushes each of us to consider how the currents of hate that led to this historical crime are present in the world today. It leads one to care, it leads us to care in a more particular way about the Rohingya people today, or about the resurgence of white supremacy and anti-Semitism in the United States at Charlottesville. And it brings one to see the danger implicit in anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States and other countries today. I think we can speculate that a more particular experience of the Holocaust, afforded by meaningful consideration of the Holocaust and the experience of the Holocaust and the experience of Auschwitz, contributes to creating a different kind of 21st century citizen. This is, I think, a point very important for us in the honors program, a different kind of first 21st century citizen, one who has a deeper visceral moral appreciation of what those crimes of the Nazi period involved in human terms, and a better and deeper understanding of the enormity of this experience. This kind of learning and this kind of historical writing and understanding is about extending our historical capacity for empathy and compassion. This is a crucial element, it seems to me anyway, when it comes to right and just behavior in the global world. So here's an odd thing, and I think it is very consistent with some of the learning which we've done from Mark Bloch's book about the craft of the historian. But it sometimes seems as though there are questions in history which are completely resolved and finished and understood. The Industrial Revolution, World War I, the French War in Indochina. And then it happens in history, in the discipline of history, that a new generation of historians comes along and questions the assumptions and certainties of their predecessors and offers new theories and interpretations of these apparently familiar historical happenings. The narrative, the story that we tell, changes, and we understand the historical happenings differently. And I would challenge you to think about how Mark Bloch would think about those few sentences. I think he would agree with them. Sometimes it is a matter of new evidence, new documents, or new indicators of what occurred in the past. Sometimes it is a reframing of old assumptions about the time and place of the happenings. Sometimes it is a shift from agency to structure and back. And sometimes it is the result of new thinking about the concepts and methods of history itself, how historians should proceed in researching and explaining complex events in the past. It seems to me that the occurrence and the causes of the Holocaust fall in this category of important historical realignment in the past 20 years. After a period of several decades in which the central facts of the Nazi war against Europe's Jews were thought to be understood, horrible as those facts are, but beyond any serious doubt about causes, extent, and consequences, there is now reconsideration. And Tim Snyder provides this kind of rethinking for the Holocaust. That's why I've asked you to read just a few chapters of Tim Snyder's book, Black Earth. So let's take a slightly broader perspective still. How should we try to understand massive, major, and horrible events like the Holocaust? The Holocaust and several other periods of mass murder and repression of the 20th century represent horrific historical events that are very difficult to understand, or frankly even to study in an honest, unblinking way as a truthful historian. Those events include things like the Armenian Genocide of 1915, the murder of 6 million European Jews in the Holocaust, 1941 to 45, Stalin's deliberate murder by starvation of millions of Ukrainian peasants, referred to as the Holodomor, 1932 and 33, Stalin's creation and operation of thousands of forced labor camps in the Gulag, 1944, even before the end of World War II, through the collapse of the Soviet Union. These are huge events which strain our ability to understand and to feel compassion. And we are reading Tim Snyder's book exactly because he offers new and in many ways even more horrible historical description of the deliberate state-driven killings that occurred between 1932 and 1945. In other words, Snyder is trying to do what Mark Bloch is posing for us. He is trying to be an honest, detail and fact-oriented historian, not completely committed to the assumptions of the past and trying to rethink the nature of the historical phenomena which he is considering. Snyder argues that the Nazi war of extermination against the Jews has been importantly misunderstood. Too centered on Germany, when the majority of genocide and murder occurred further east, in the lands that he calls the Bloodlands, largely focused on extermination camps, whereas most killing of Jews occurred near the cities and villages where they lived, most commonly by gunfire, not in gas chambers. insufficiently attentive to the relationship between extermination of people and destruction of institutions of state in subject countries, the ways in which Stalin and Hitler destroyed state institutions in Poland and Ukraine and Estonia and so forth, and then perpetrated mass slaughter. And finally, our understanding, according to Snyder, has been developed without sufficient attention to Hitler's own worldview, within which the Nazi war of extermination was framed. Snyder also links the mass killing of Jews with the almost equally numerous mass killings by the Soviet state of peasants, Poles, Ukrainians, and other non-Russians in exactly the same region. This is one of the striking things about his work, both in Black Earth and also Bloodlands. So Snyder offers several new bodies of research which contributes to our better understanding of the Holocaust. And his work is controversial, which is often true of historical research. He relocates the geography of the killings of the Jews to the Bloodlands, not to Germany. He notices and documents that Stalin's war on the peasants in Ukraine occupied and occurred in much the same region. And he notes something really striking, that Stalin and Hitler were remarkably similar, even though they were communist and Nazi at opposite ends of the spectrum. And they shared the same techniques of slaughter, political goals, and murderous strategies throughout this region. Here's a map of what Snyder refers to as the Bloodlands, and it's worth paying attention to, kind of studying this map. You will see familiar place names, and then you will also see unfamiliar place names, places that I think you probably would not have been able to locate on the map. Lithuania and Latvia, for example. You might have known that they were Baltic countries and therefore near the Baltic Sea. Belarus, currently politically very active with large demonstrations. Ukraine, the location of Kiev, the location of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This is the central part of Europe. It is Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and it is on the borderlands between German hegemony during World War II and Soviet hegemony. And part of this Bloodlands is actually in the territory of the Soviet Union, and part is in the countries of Poland, Ukraine, and so forth. Another piece of the historical rethinking which Snyder urges on us is his thought that we need to rethink the role that we attribute to Auschwitz as a central symbol or icon of the Holocaust. He points out that most Jews were not murdered in concentration camps. Rather, they were hunted, captured, surrounded, detained, and murdered by shooting, hunger, and poison gas in the millions in towns, villages, and cities throughout the Bloodlands, but most numerous in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. Men, women, and children, all civilians, were killed indiscriminately and deliberately without any compassion. And furthermore, local collaborators, Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, throughout the region, local collaborators played essential roles in the murders of Jews. The German army, the Gestapo, the different parts of the German military were present, but much of the killing occurred at the hands of collaborators and partners of the Germans in occupied countries. When we think of the gates of Auschwitz, I visited Auschwitz 4 or 5 years ago, took a number of photographs, some of which I feature here. But when we think of the gates of Auschwitz as the central image of the Holocaust, we overlook the equally terrible but often unacknowledged circumstances of the death of at least 2/3 of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Each of these victims had his own story and her own story. And Snyder is especially good in his interviews with his ability to weave together the big story and the microscopic stories of these individual, often nameless victims and their death and their disappearance from this earth. When we think of Germany as the central location of the Holocaust, we forget that the Jewish population of Germany was less than 1% of its population, whereas the Jewish population of Poland represented a sizable percentage of Poland in 1935 through 1940. Here's another point which Snyder comments on, but I'm bringing some additional material to you just to give you some background. But it is part of the rethinking of the nature of the Holocaust. It is a refocusing on ordinary people as murderers, as collaborators, as willing participants in the murder of the Jews and some other peoples of Central Europe. Two books in particular have turned out to be very important in the past 15 years, really. One is Thomas Browning, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland, and the other, Daniel Goldhagen, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. And these books both describe the behavior of a police unit, what had been a somewhat normal police unit in Hamburg, which was assigned special duties as order police in Poland in 1940. These duties amounted to collecting and massacring large numbers of Jewish men, women, and children. And the content of these historical books, these sociological books, is based on interviews which were conducted in war crimes type trials after the war. And these interviews showed that these were very ordinary, middle-aged, apolitical men of the police unit who picked up the work of murder and extermination with zeal and efficiency. They were not coerced. Browning makes that very clear. They were not indoctrinated. They were not Nazis. They were not deranged and insane. Yet they turned to the work of mass murder with enthusiasm. Another important book, which perhaps one day you'll have an inclination to read, a book by Jan Gross called Neighbors, The Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, Poland. This is a case study of a single massacre of Jews in a small Polish town during the Nazi occupation, but it was not instigated or directed by the German occupying forces. Rather, it was a local indigenous action by non-Jewish residents in the town who gathered up their Jewish neighbors, forced them into a barn, and burned the barn, killing about 1,600 Jewish men, women, and children. A horrific story to imagine, to hear, and to read about. He considers the question of motives. Were there deep hatreds which were expressed in this village? And the reality is that this was a village which was mixed Catholic and Jewish and had been so for a very long time. So it was not a village in transition. There was Polish anti-Semitism, but it didn't appear before the war to be murderous anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism was certainly a part of the story. But he also finds that there was a more mundane motive for killing the Jews of this village, and that was a desire to expropriate the property of the Jewish victims. These were all poor rural people, but there was nonetheless a desire by the neighbors to take the property of the Jewish victims. So why is it important for us in the honors program and in this course to think about the Holocaust, to try to gather some recent historical thinking about the Holocaust? Why is this an important issue? And I think there are many reasons. I would say that the history of genocide must be understood correctly for several different reasons. First of all, we honor the victims by discovering their fates. Simply knowing that 6 million plus Jews died, that's pretty superficial knowledge. Another point I would make is that new historical perspectives promise to provide a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how this horrific part of our recent past came to be. The institutional, political, ideological, and local circumstances that facilitated the mass murder of the majority of Europe's Jewish population. This is very analogous to the comments that Bloch makes, the importance of understanding history. It is important that we understand history and that we know our historical origins. A third point, that we can learn more about the political and ideological causes of this policy of extermination by following the wartime actions of Germany and the Soviet Union during the period of alliance and warfare involving these two totalitarian countries. And this is where substantially new ideas have emerged about the kind of the structure and dynamics of the Holocaust. And finally, we are led to ask deep and troubling questions, deeply humanly troubling questions about ordinary Germans, ordinary Ukrainians, ordinary Poles, and if circumstances had been different, it might have been ordinary Englishmen, ordinary Americans, who participated in the murders of millions of innocent, suffering people. And so for us, there's a benefit, there's a value in learning about the history of the Holocaust and its detail and its horrible dynamics. For us, maybe we can learn more about what must be done when unthinkable and dangerous actions are occurring in countries far from our own country. So Bosnia in the 1990s, the Rohingya crisis in Burma in the past 5 years, the current Uyghur crisis in China. By our having a better understanding of the human reality of the Holocaust, maybe this gives us, as citizens of the United States, a stronger commitment to the idea the United States should play a role in ending genocide against various groups of people in other countries. And of course, by studying the history of the Holocaust, we can learn more about hatred, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and the literally insane extremes of political ideology that were shared by the nations led by Hitler and Stalin. There are apologists in both Soviet Union and Germany who wanted to say this was all about the leaders. The leaders had these terrible plans and goals, and we Germans or we Russians were just dupes. But I think that Snyder would say, no, that's not a correct theory. Rather, Germans were supportive of Hitler's plan of war, and it is not possible to separate responsibility from ordinary people in Germany and Ukraine and Poland and other countries. There's another point about history which I wanted to make in this context, and it's about memory and the way that we constitute ourselves, exactly as Mark Bloch said, as historical beings. So we have memories, which are stories told to us, stories that we tell about ourselves. But a point which historians like Snyder, but also another historian whom I admire very much, Tony Judd, make the point that many of our national memories, our memories of ourselves as a people, many of those memories are simply false. Tony Judd talks about the European myth of resistance to Nazi oppression. And he finds that the romantic stories of La Résistance in France, Holland, and elsewhere are greatly overstated. In fact, he believes they are largely false. The great majority of French citizens, Dutch citizens, and other occupied countries were either passive participants or sometimes active participants. In France, for example, many French people and functionaries were involved in rounding up the Jews of France and exporting them to certain death. So the false memory, the kind of romanticized memory of resistance, the Humphrey Bogart kind of memory of resistance to Nazi oppression, Tony Judd and Tim Snyder basically say it's a fine plot for a movie, but for an historian, we have to understand the details and the truth of the matter is quite different. In fact, most of occupied Europe either collaborated with the occupying forces or accepted with perhaps resignation, but also equanimity, the presence and activities of the German military forces. The Nazis could certainly never have sustained their hegemony over most of the continent if they had not had willing collaborators in the countries that they dominated. And this deliberate forgetting by French people, Dutch people, East German people, Polish people, this deliberate forgetting of national and citizen culpability all across Europe is a part of contemporary Polish politics. In the past couple of years, the conservative Polish government has passed laws making it a crime to say that Poles were responsible for any kind of atrocities against Jews during the Holocaust. Their official legal view is that Germany committed atrocities and Polish people did not participate. But this is historically incorrect. Tony Judd points out a couple of important ideas. First of all, that history matters. Who agrees with that? Well, Mark Bloch agrees with that. Our reading of his book on history makes it very clear. He thinks that getting history right and truthful and honestly is of great importance. Judd also points out that oppressors and tyrants are invariably interested in concealing their culpability. Hitler had a story to tell. So did Stalin. While, quote, innocent citizens are likewise inclined to minimize their own involvement in the crimes of their governments. And Judd believes bad myths give rise eventually to bad politics. It's almost like a disease that by having absorbed the idea that we had no culpability for this crime or this bad behavior, we are, in a sense, perpetuating the bad behavior. So, according to Tony Judd, whom you haven't read, according to Tim Snyder, whom you have read, and according to Mark Bloch, the work of honest history is crucial for humanity's ability to achieve a better future. I wanted to end with a couple of comments about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which we've referred to a couple times, but it's very pertinent in this context because the whole point about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, South Africa is, of course, where it originated. The whole point, though, is to come to truthful assessment of what occurred during the apartheid period or during the period of France's Vichy regime when the Jews of France were identified by French policemen and exported by French functionaries to German control and eventually death in concentration camps. The purpose of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to face truths like those with honesty and come to some sense of reconciliation and recognition of the crimes which had occurred in the past. A very nice statement from the South African Ministry of Justice: a commission is a necessary exercise to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past on a morally accepted basis and to advance the cause of reconciliation. I have a list of historical circumstances where truth and reconciliation might be helpful. I've already mentioned the first of them, the expatriation of French Jews by the French Vichy government into the hands of the Nazis. But the Rwandan genocide actually has had a round of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Also in Argentina, the Argentine military's policy of disappearing large numbers of its opponents, including often young people in your age range, who were then consigned to secret imprisonment, to torture, to murder, and to permanent disappearance. The parents, the friends, never heard again of what their fate had been. Another Truth and Reconciliation issue very naturally might be the history in this country of white violence against black people in the American South. The enforcing of white power through Jim Crow laws, through lynchings, through shootings, and through violent intimidation. We have not had a truth and reconciliation process, though we do have honest historians who have tried to tell those stories. Organized ethnic cleansing and mass murder in Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia would be another important example. The fact and the nature and the human experience of slavery as practiced in the United States. Likewise, it makes sense to think about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And the crimes of death squads in El Salvador in the 1980s, including for the U.S. to come to an honest recognition of the ways in which the United States military and intelligence services were involved in support and encouragement and training and the provision of weapons to the death squads in El Salvador. So this is a somewhat longer telling of the story, but I wanted to give you some good context for why I asked you to read Tim Snyder, why we're coming back periodically to the circumstances of the Holocaust and the circumstances of what was really the most horrific period that I can think of in human history, and what it tells us about the importance of our kind of moral status as citizens today and our obligation to understand the past and to truthfully recognize even the most unhappy parts of that history. Thank you.